Roll, Jordan, roll. All right, we're on YouTube. Welcome to anybody watching on YouTube at this particular moment or at some point in the future. Glad that you're joining us for our study in the book of Acts. We are today in Acts chapter 16, picking up with verse 11. We have started the second missionary journey, and we talked about that some last week to some of the opening stages of that missionary journey, and we talked last about the vision of the Macedonian man who calls Paul to come on over and preach the gospel here. And so that's where Paul decides that's what God is calling him to do. We talked last week about how God shut the door on certain things and evidently opened the door on this one particular thing, and that Paul is walking through that door, endeavoring to walk through that door. One thing to make note of that I did make note of last week, if you look in verse 10 of chapter 16, it reads like this: when he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. Before that, it's all they and them language. It's third person plural language. In verse 10, it becomes first person plural language. Why is that the case? It appears that Luke has joined the missionary party. That's what most scholars will say here. Luke evidently was in Troas. That's where they depart. That's where they have the vision. Paul has that visionary dream, and they decide to go across into Macedonia. And but it goes from being a third person plural reporting of things to a first person plural, which means Luke has joined the company of the apostles. And we'll see that off and on for the remainder of the book. So we're getting an eyewitness account at certain points, literal eyewitness account, not being passed on to Luke, but he's there as the things happen. And so just to make you aware of that here at this particular point. Let's go ahead and read those next verses, verses 11 and following. They're there in your handout. We therefore set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrace the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate by the river, where we supposed there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my house." And she prevailed upon us. They make their way across. It was usually a 2-day journey to go from Troas to Philippi. It was usually a 5-day journey, I'm sorry. It all depended on what the weather was like and what the currents were like and all that kind of stuff. That it took them only 2 days here as compared to 5 days, which is reported in Acts 20, verse 6, means that they had good weather and were able to make good progress pretty quickly. They end up in Philippi, and they go about things just like they always do. What do they do when they get into the city? They go look for a synagogue. Why? So that they can start preaching the gospel to the Jews that are there, and also the God-fearers who are part of the Jewish communities. And so they look for one in Philippi, but there's no synagogue. What does that mean? Well, it means there are not a lot of Jews in Philippi. There's an old custom that says that you can start a synagogue if you have 10 male Jews. So you only need 10. Well, they evidently didn't have 10 good men to get a synagogue going. They didn't have enough Jewish men to get that synagogue going, which tells you it's a really, really small group. And so what they have instead are these places of worship out by the riverside. They're pseudo-synagogues. And remember, a synagogue is just the substitute for the temple. Of course, you didn't offer sacrifices in the synagogue. You did the same kind of service that we do. You read scripture, you had prayers, and you would sing. So they have not established a synagogue, and they've got out by the riverside these places where prayer is taking place. This would be Jewish prayers. The Jewish tradition has prayers that you would pray. And so they were going through the rudiments of their own worship service, kind of, these women who would gather. As we said a couple weeks ago, women were especially attracted to the Jewish tradition because it instilled the basic values that were helpful to them, family values, and it curbed the sexual adventurousness of the men and held them to a higher account. And so women were attracted to the Jewish way, and they were ready to embrace it because, of course, they didn't have to get circumcised. So they were glad to be part of the Jewish community. So there was evidently these women who were what we would call God-fearers. Again, they're Gentile women who like the way of Judaism and are following in the way of Judaism as much as they can without actually becoming Jews. So they've come and they've gathered and they're having prayer together. And Paul finds this place, hears about it, finds it, and goes to them and starts ministering to these women. We don't have any testimony about how many women actually embraced the gospel at that particular moment. We only hear about one woman, and she's a famous woman in the biblical text, Lydia. She's from the city of Thyatira, which if you look on your maps, if you still have your maps with you, on Paul's second journey, you can see Thyatira is back over in Asia Minor. It's between Pergamum and Sardis and Smyrna. Thyatira is right in the middle of it. And so she's from there and has gone over to Philippi. Thyatira was known for its industry with respect to the purple dye. There's a certain kind of fish that you catch and that you kind of process to get the dye from, and it's a very expensive and very time-consuming kind of process. And so it was a luxury kind of item. She was evidently very successful in it. So number one, she's a pretty savvy businesswoman. Number two, she's pretty wealthy. And she's in Philippi applying her trade there. And she's one of these God-fearers who's been meeting, and so she hears the gospel and she embraces the gospel. And her enthusiasm for Christ evidently is palpable because not only does she embrace Christ for herself, but she has the gospel preached to her household. Now, we're not told anything about a husband. We're not told anything about who made up the household other than we could assume servants. So we don't know what that means. But the gospel is preached to the household, and all of them are baptized together alongside Lydia. Well, that's not all, though. Not only does she want the gospel preached to her friends or her family members or whatever, but she also wants her house to be the base for the church. In the text where it says there, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my house. That's not come and visit. That's not come and stay for a few days. That's come and set up shop in my house. She's opening her house to the church. Remember, the churches are meeting in houses. That's how you did church in those days. And you gathered in homes, and it was usually somebody who was pretty wealthy, who had a big enough house for a gathering to take place. And so they set up shop in her house. So she gives evidence of her sincerity and faith, by having all her household baptized, hear the gospel and baptized, and then inviting the church into the house and saying, this will be home base for the church. Very enthusiastic believer. Well, the whole of the story is a wonderful story, a warm story. Everybody knows the story who's ever been to church for any length of time. She's the first convert in Europe. Famous woman. All you women out there, you ought to be embracing Lydia. Go Lydia, go Lydia, go Lydia. But you ought to embrace this story too. We kind of read over it and forget how unusual a situation is taking place here. Remember, it takes 10 Jewish men to make a synagogue, and there aren't evidently 10 men around to make a synagogue there. So the women are out worshiping beside the riverside, and Paul comes and preaches to the women. Now that's newsworthy. Remember, in the Jewish tradition, you didn't teach the law to women. It was considered, what was it that I said? I can't remember the quote, but it was better for the law, to be done away with than for it to be preached to a woman, according to the Jewish tradition. So for Paul to be preaching the gospel to these women, that's revolutionary. Paul gets a bad reputation for being, a he-man, woman-hater kind of guy, And you can find some passages that, you can read, not that bad, but you can read it as kind of anti-women or whatever. But then this happens. I mean, Paul preaches the gospel to them. Paul works alongside women in all the churches. And so, never take that critique of Paul, without a grain of salt, because the gospel, the church, is a much more revolutionary force than we give it credit for being. It broke down barriers, and in fact, I've given you there at the bottom of that section there on the second page the quote from Galatians 3:27 through 28, a famous quote, famous passage from Paul's writings. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves as Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Radical, radical, radical kind of thing going on here. I would assume that they're, at this point, now, I wouldn't carry that conjecture too far. I wouldn't go too far with that. I think I would rest with, it's an amazing thing that Paul founded a church with all these women. Now, he may have left somebody there. That's what I'm saying. Now, Paul's teachings, women aren't to be the leaders in the church. The men are. That's there. I'm sorry, it just is. But that's more a sense of propriety with respect to, the calling of God on ministers and that kind of stuff. It's not anti-woman. It's just the nature of things. But yes, it's significant that he goes to women and preaches to them, number one, and that the first church formed there in Europe, in Philippi, is made up of women to start with. I would assume he left somebody there with them to get it going. And you don't know how many people in their households, any of the men who got converted or whatever. So again, I wouldn't go too far with that, because we just don't have any evidence to really go that far. But it's still significant just as it is. All right, go to the next section of verses there, down at the bottom of page 2. Here's the long section, and here's the great story, and we're going to draw things to look at from it, but just hear it all together as a story first. You know this story, you've heard it before. Remember, we're in Philippi, and this is the beginning of the second missionary journey, or shortly after the beginning of the second missionary journey. The gospel has gone from Asia Minor over to Macedonia. Big step there. The gospel is going further out. But we have some of the same things happen there that have happened previously. One day, as we were going to the place of prayer, they keep going to the place of prayer, keep preaching there, we met a female slave who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners a great deal of money by fortune-telling. While she followed Paul and us, there's the us again, Luke's in the party, she would cry out, "These men are slaves of the Most High who proclaim to you the way of salvation." She kept doing this for many days. But Paul, very much annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I order you in the name of Jesus Christ, come out of her." And it came out of her that very hour. But when her owners saw that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. When they had brought them before the magistrates, they said, "These men these Jews are disturbing our city and are advocating customs that are not lawful for us, being Romans, to adopt or observe. The crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates had them stripped of their clothing and ordered them to be beaten with rods. After they had given them a severe flogging, they threw them into prison and ordered the jailer to keep them securely. Following these instructions, he put them in the innermost cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was an earthquake so violent that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's chains were unfastened. When the jailer woke up and saw the prison doors wide open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, since he supposed that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted in a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." The jailer called for lights, and rushing in, he fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them outside and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They answered, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." They spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. At the same hour of the night, he took them and washed their wounds. Then he and his entire family were baptized without delay. He brought them up into the house and set food before them. And he and his entire household rejoiced that he had become a believer. When morning came, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported the message to Paul, saying, "The magistrates sent word to let you go. Therefore come out now and go in peace." But Paul replied, "They have beaten us in public, uncondemned, men who are Romans, and have thrown us into prison, and now they are going to discharge us in secret? Certainly not. Let them come and take us out themselves." The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans, so they came and apologized to them. And they took them out and asked them to leave the city. After leaving the prison, they went to Lydia's house, and when they had seen and encouraged the brothers and sisters there, they departed. Big story. Y'all know that story. Powerful story. Wonderful story. Several things to take from it without going verse by verse by verse. First, one of the things we see taking place here is the fact that the gospel can stir up the anger of sinners against the gospel. In other words, preaching the gospel can bring trouble to you. Watch out. The slave girl, main character in the story, is a demon-possessed person. She has the power of telling fortunes. But she also seems to be kind of a carny sideshow kind of person, you know. Her oddity, her demeanor, there's something about it. She probably has a kind of charismatic, ecstatic. Her utterings are random and surprising. And so she's probably as much a curiosity as she is sought for her ability to tell the future. I mean, remember when John the Baptist came on the scene? I mean, you got this fire and brimstone preacher out in the wilderness, banging the pulpit and telling everybody they're going to hell in a handbasket if they aren't careful. And he's dressed, like Elijah. I mean, people come out to see the show as much as they do to hear John preach the gospel to them, or preach before the gospel to them. So there's certainly that element to it. But anyway, it's a demon possession kind of situation. Now, the way the story tells it, it makes it sound like Paul just got annoyed with her and he decided to take care of her, so he delivered her of the demon, as if he didn't care about her otherwise. If she hadn't bugged him, he would just let her go. I don't think we should read the story that literally that way. I think it bugged Paul, obviously. I think he probably suspected that her hanging around them was impeding the spread of the gospel. And I think that's added to the fact that he determines that she is possessed of a demon. And so I think the whole of it, rather than just Luke's telling, she was bugging him, and that's why he did it, I think the whole of it should be taken into account, and that Paul had compassion on her and delivered her of that demon possession. Well, the main point in this part of the story is that they do this and they mess up the businessmen's desires. This is a slave girl. They own her. she's demon-possessed, and they're using her cruelly and in a corrupted fashion to make money for themselves. And now that the demon's gone and she's not able to do that any longer, Paul's ruined their business. And so they stir up everybody in town about it. They bring them before, they have them arrested and end up getting them thrown into jail and all that kind of stuff. And so, Paul and Silas pay for preaching the gospel. And so we see two things in play here. Number one, money talks. And if you ever mess with anybody's opportunity to make money, even if especially if it's forbidden, money or forbidden way of doing things, you're going to pay for it. I was reading an article just yesterday about some of the Mexican cartels and how they have these disinformation agents now. These are people who go around spreading slanders and lies about the Mexican military that's trying to tamp down the cartels. Why are they doing that? Because the cartels don't want their business to go dry. They don't want the military to end things there. And so they've hired these people who are like PR people who go around planting stories about how the military is, doing horrible and terrible things, and they're shooting people randomly, and they're corrupt and all this kind of stuff. So they're trying to counter the work of the Mexican government and trying to bring the cartels to an end. You mess with people's way of making money, especially when it's illegal, they're going to make you pay. And so that's one aspect of what's going on here. The other is just that, whenever you do gospel work, expect that something negative is going to come back at you. Why? Because you're messing with Satan's work in the world. Satan doesn't want us to have success. Satan doesn't want us to bring people to Christ. Satan doesn't want us to mess up his plans. And so we can expect negative consequences. If we're having any kind of success, quote unquote, in preaching the gospel and ministering the gospel, Satan is going to make us pay for that. Second thing we see here is that these businessmen manipulate crowds into becoming a destructive mob. I talked a little bit about that on Sunday. I was going to talk a whole lot more about it on Palm Sunday than I did, but I didn't feel led to go in that direction. But the danger of a mob, creating a mob, instigating a mob, and we've seen that in our day and age, have we not? You get a crowd of people and you get them all riled up and you turn them into a mob, and they wreak havoc all over everything. They burn down cities. It's a dangerous thing to stir up a mob. They do that here. Interestingly, they use, it's almost comical, they use anti-Jewish sentiment to get Paul and Silas arrested. Paul and Silas are Jews, but they aren't there to make people into Jewish, convert people into Judaism. They're there to make people Christians. But again, there's not many Jews in the community, so it's easier to scapegoat a group that doesn't exist around you. It's easier to use them as your whipping post people, and so they stir them up. I mean, that's what the leaders say before the magistrates. These men, verse 20, these Jews are disturbing our city. They're using anti-Jewish sentiment to stir up the leaders of Philippi against Paul and Silas. Well, Paul and Silas, are trying to make Christians, not Jews. So it's totally slanderous, complete fabrication. But anyway, it's what they use to stir up the crowd. And that anti-Jewish sentiment, right? Prejudice always stirs up a crowd. And they stir up the mob against Paul and Silas, and they get them arrested and get them beaten and get them thrown into jail. Great evil can be unleashed by the mob spirit. Uncontrollable evil often gets stirred up by and unleashed by the mob spirit. And so we are supposed to be people of truth who resist the mob spirit, not getting caught up in it ourselves. Always insisting on the truth being spoken and always insisting on law and order being maintained. Justice. We stand for justice, carried out in the right way. And again, we resist that mob spirit mentality. Third thing we see, Paul and Silas's amazing response to their incarceration. They've been beaten with rods. They've been, falsely accused. They've been locked up. They've been thrown in the innermost part of the prison. They're in stocks. You might think that they would be, number one, kind of angry at God. I mean, we're preaching the gospel. Why are we getting this kind of response? And they would be angry at all the people around them, and they would be wondering, what they were going to do. They'd be anxious, fearful, all those types of things. So how do they respond? At midnight, they're singing and praising God and giving thanks to Him. And I dare say they're giving thanks to God that they can suffer as Christ suffered. That's what Paul talks about in a lot of his letters. He rejoices in the fact that he can suffer as Christ suffered, so that he can know Christ even in that dimension. So instead of responding as we are wont to respond as human beings when trouble comes our way, especially hard trouble, they rejoice in God. They give thanks to Him. They pray to Him, and they bless God. They sing hymns of praise to Him. And of course, as we talked about on Sunday a little bit, one of the ways that we're called to respond to our troubles is to try and turn it around. Rather than letting it, evoke responses of negativity of one sort or another, we try to get out in front and say, here's a trial, how can I bear it for the glory of God? Here's a difficulty, how can I return praise and thanksgiving to God? How can I turn this in such a way that the world will rejoice in God somehow through my adversity? That's what Paul and Silas are practicing right here. How do we respond to our trials and tribulation? A fourth and last thing to take note of here, we see how God uses the miracle that takes place in the prison to bring someone to Himself. We've talked about this on several occasions in several sermons along the way. Everything that happens to us in our life is about one thing in the end. It's not about our health and happiness and wholeness and joy in this life. It's about God's work of salvation being carried out in our lives and through our lives in the world around us. And that's what happens here. When Paul and Silas are rejoicing in God, giving thanks to God and praising Him, the earthquake comes, the doors fling open, the chains are shaken off of them, and they're able to take off and leave. They're free to go. And so a great miracle is taking place. But Paul and Silas and that company of missionaries don't take off. They stay. We're not told why. They were not told, why they did it or if they knew why they should do it. They just stay. What happens next, of course, the jailer, realizing what's going on, realizing the prison's wide open, realizing everybody take off, he pulls out his sword to take his own life. Why? Because he's responsible for their lives. And if he loses them, he'll be killed. So he might as well take his life in his own hand rather than leave it up to the higher-ups to do, according to their own whims. So he's getting ready to kill himself, and Paul and Silas call out, stop, we're still here. And he's amazed by it. He throws on the lights, goes running in. He sees the prisoner still there, and he's overwhelmed with gratitude and with awe and wonder. How in the world has this happened? He's heard all this singing. He's heard all this praising of God. He knows enough about these people that they're religious people of some sort. And so when this happens, he says, what must I do to be saved? What must I do to become one of you? And so Paul and Silas preach the gospel. And again, an extraordinary thing happens. Not only does this man hear the gospel, his whole household hears the gospel. They all become believers. The man and his family take care of the wounds of Paul and Silas that they've received. He ministers to them in their need. But a family is brought to Christ through this miracle. The miracle isn't just about Paul and Silas getting out and having their suffering ended. The miracle is about God bringing somebody else to Himself. Paul and Silas's life, their health and well-being isn't the main thing. The main thing is God's use of their lives and their circumstances for the sake of spreading the gospel, for the sake of bringing other people into the kingdom, for the sake of growing them up in their own salvation, making them more and more like Jesus Christ through that circumstance. And so it's a powerful miracle, but again, the miracle is used to further the work of the kingdom in that place. Last thing that we could talk about is where we'll pick up next time when we come back, and that is the fact that Paul won't let those authorities get away with just releasing him. Get him out of here quick, get him out of here quick, they say when they find out that they're Roman citizens. No, says Paul. We're going to make you own up to the fact that you've mistreated us, and we'll say something about why that is when we come back next time. Thoughts, questions, comments? Great story. Lots there. You can probably come up with a lot more things there than we've come up with, but those are some important things, I think, right there. All right. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for anybody who's watching by YouTube. Glad to have been together today in the house of the